The loud, sharp sound of the slap echoed through the grand entrance of the mansion. Gasps filled the air. Every conversation stopped. Even the music from the party inside seemed to fade for a moment, as if the entire world had paused to witness what had just happened. The woman, elegantly dressed in a midnight blue gown, stood with her right hand still raised, her fingers trembling from the force of the slap. Her face twisted in anger. "How dare you," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. The man in front of her remained still. He was tall, with dark skin that glowed under the evening lights, his broad shoulders squared in an unshaken stance. A slow, controlled breath left his lips as he touched his cheek, feeling the sting of her hand. The guests at the luxurious party watched in stunned silence. No one had ever seen something like this happen at a place like this, not at a mansion belonging to one of the wealthiest families in the country. The woman, still furious, glared at the man, who was dressed in a simple black uniform. A gatekeeper. A nobody. She had always believed that people like him should know their place. "You shouldn't have done that," the man finally spoke. His voice was deep, steady, and calm, almost too calm. The woman scoffed. "I don't take orders from gatekeepers." The murmurs among the guests grew louder, whispers spreading like wildfire. A few people took a step forward as if wanting to intervene, but something about the man's stance made them hesitate. He wasn't reacting the way they had expected. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't apologizing. He was just watching her. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the woman's face. The man exhaled slowly and turned away without another word. The woman smirked. To her, this meant victory. She had put him in his place. She had no idea, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. A few minutes earlier, the mansion was buzzing with energy. Elegant men and women dressed in designer outfits moved around the grand ballroom, sipping champagne and exchanging conversations about business, politics, and luxury. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above them, casting a golden glow over the extravagance of the night. Out in the front courtyard, a line of luxury cars stretched down the driveway, each vehicle more expensive than the last. Valets rushed around, opening doors for guests, guiding them inside. At the entrance gate, the man, who everyone assumed was just a security guard, stood with his hands behind his back. His posture was relaxed, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Every car that entered, every guest that arrived, he noticed it all. Then she came. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up, and the woman stepped out. Everything about her screamed power and privilege, from her flawless makeup to the way she barely glanced at the valet as she handed him the car keys. She started walking toward the entrance, but the man at the gate stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was polite but firm. She barely looked at him. "Move. I need to see your invitation," he said, his tone unchanged. Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "Do you know who I am?" The man nodded. "Yes, I do. But I still need to see your invitation." She let out a sharp laugh. "Are you serious? Everyone inside knows me." "I understand, but it's my responsibility to check all guests." Her face darkened. No one had ever spoken to her this way. Especially not a gatekeeper. "Step aside," she ordered, moving forward. But the man didn't move. A hush fell over the nearby staff. The valets, the security team, everyone froze, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman's hands clenched into fists. "I don't have time for this nonsense," she snapped. The man's expression didn't change. "I'll have to ask you to wait until I can confirm your entry." That was when it happened. Her patience snapped. With no hesitation, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. The force of the slap echoed through the entrance, catching the attention of everyone nearby. Gasps filled the air. The valet stood frozen. Even the guests inside the ballroom turned toward the doorway. And that's where the story truly began. After the slap, the woman's breathing was heavy. She expected him to react. Maybe he would shout, or push her back, or at the very least, look humiliated. But he didn't do any of those things. He just looked at her. His deep brown eyes locked onto hers, unreadable, emotionless. A flicker of something powerful, passed behind his gaze. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." His tone was calm, but there was something in it. Something that sent a strange chill down her spine. She scoffed, masking her unease. "I don't take orders from gatekeepers." Silence stretched between them. The air felt heavier. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the mansion. The woman let out a shaky breath. A few of the guests were still staring, their eyes bouncing between her and the now empty spot where the man had been standing. She smirked. Good. Now he knew his place. Or so she thought. Because, in the next few minutes, something would happen that would shake her entire world apart. Inside the mansion. The party continued, but there was an undercurrent in the air. People whispered in hushed voices about what had happened at the entrance. Some were already sending texts, spreading the story beyond the mansion walls. The woman, however, felt triumphant. She moved through the ballroom with confidence, greeting high-profile guests, exchanging fake pleasantries. But then, something strange happened. She noticed people glancing at her, their expressions shifting from friendly to something else. A few guests exchanged looks when she walked past. Some even stepped away from her. At first, she ignored it. But as time passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, an older gentleman approached her. Someone with real power. He was one of the city's most respected businessmen, someone even she looked up to. His eyes were cold. "I would leave if I were you," he said. She blinked. "What?" The man leaned in, lowering his voice. "You slapped the wrong person." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" A slow smile curled on his lips, but it wasn't friendly. "You'll find out soon enough." A chill ran through her. And then, as if on cue, the music stopped. A hush fell over the ballroom. The grand double doors at the end of the hall opened. And there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the man she had slapped. Only now, he wasn't wearing his gatekeeper uniform. Now, he looked like he belonged. The guests turned to him with respect. Some even nodded. And then, he spoke. His voice echoed through the silent hall. "I'm sure many of you already know who I am." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "But for those who don't, allow me to introduce myself." He took a slow step forward. "I'm not just a gatekeeper." His eyes locked onto the woman's. "I own this place." A suffocating silence filled the grand ballroom. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the whispers, the shifting of feet, the way the air itself had changed the moment he had spoken. The man, the one she had slapped, was no gatekeeper. He was the owner of the mansion. Her throat felt dry. Her legs stiffened. She tried to steady herself, but an icy dread crept up her spine. He took another step forward, descending the grand staircase. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. The confidence in his movements sent a clear message: he was in control. Guests moved aside as he approached. Some lowered their gazes in respect. Others stared, waiting for what would happen next. The woman, once so sure of her power, now stood frozen. "Miss Cassandra Wright," the man said, his voice carrying through the room. Her breath caught. He knew her name. "I assume you're enjoying my party?" he asked. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. His lips curled slightly, though the amusement in his eyes was not friendly. Strange. You had a lot to say a few minutes ago. The whispering around them grew louder. Cassandra's mind raced. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had spent years building her reputation, climbing social circles, making sure she was always on top. Now, in mere moments, she was being humiliated, and by a man she had mistaken for a gatekeeper. She forced a stiff smile. There must be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding at all, he cut her off smoothly. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. You arrived at my home, refused to show an invitation, disrespected my staff, and then, you slapped me. A ripple of gasps spread through the guests. Some people looked at Cassandra with barely concealed smirks, enjoying the downfall of a woman who had often treated others like they were beneath her. Others simply watched, waiting for the final blow. Cassandra clenched her fists. She had to regain control. Somehow. I didn't realize, she started. That I was the owner, he finished for her. His tone was polite, but the steel behind his words was unmistakable. She swallowed. It was just a misunderstanding. He tilted his head, studying her. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Leave." Cassandra blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He didn't raise his voice, yet it sent a chill down her spine. "You are no longer welcome here." Laughter rippled through some of the guests. Not openly, but enough for Cassandra to feel the sting of it. Humiliation burned in her chest. "You can't be serious." "I can," he replied. "And I am." Two security guards stepped forward, waiting for his signal. Cassandra's face turned pale. She had never been thrown out of an event before. Not her. She looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one stepped forward. Even the people she once considered allies refused to meet her gaze. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. In this world, power shifted in an instant. And right now, she had none. The man, the real owner of the mansion, gestured to the guards. "Escort her out." The guards moved toward her. Cassandra felt panic rising in her chest. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't. She turned back to the man, her voice desperate now. "Please, mister," she stopped. She didn't even know his name. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. He had noticed. "I'll be generous," he said. "I'll let you walk out on your own." Cassandra's pride screamed at her to fight back, to argue, to do something, but what could she say? What power did she have now? Slowly, stiffly, she lifted her chin and turned toward the exit. The entire ballroom watched as she walked past them, each step heavy with shame. The grand doors loomed ahead. The security guards followed closely behind, making sure she didn't stop. Just before she stepped outside, she paused, gripping the edge of the doorframe. She turned her head slightly, just enough to steal one last glance at the man she had insulted. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He had already moved on. That realization stung worse than anything else. And then, without another word, she walked out. Outside the mansion. The cold night air hit her like a slap. Fitting, she thought bitterly. Her car was still parked in the driveway, but she couldn't bring herself to walk toward it just yet. For the first time in years, Cassandra felt truly powerless. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? She had spent years perfecting her image, making sure she was always seen as someone important, someone who couldn't be challenged. And in one night, with one mistake, it had all crumbled. A gust of wind sent a shiver down her spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed something. A man stood near the garden, partially hidden by shadows. Watching her. Her stomach twisted. Had he been standing there this whole time? For a moment, she thought it was one of the security guards. But as she focused on him, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Something about him felt off. He wasn't dressed like the other staff. His posture was too relaxed. And yet, the way he watched her, it was too intentional. Her heart beat faster. Who was he? She took a hesitant step toward her car, but the man didn't move. Didn't blink. A wave of unease crept over her skin. Tonight had already been a disaster. But for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. The night air felt heavier now. The humiliation of being thrown out of the mansion still burned in Cassandra's chest, but a new feeling had taken over, unease. The man in the shadows wasn't moving. He stood near the garden, half hidden by the darkness, his posture too calm, too intentional. Cassandra's instincts screamed at her to leave. She tightened her coat around her shoulders, glancing at her car just a few feet away. Get in. Drive away. Forget tonight ever happened. But, she didn't move. Something about the man kept her frozen in place. A slow breeze passed through the trees, making the branches sway. The movement shifted the shadows, revealing his face, just for a second. Cassandra's breath hitched. She had seen him before. But where? Her mind raced through memories, but they blurred together. The social events, the business deals, the countless faces she had met. Was he a waiter? A driver? Someone she had ignored in passing? She took a cautious step forward. Who are you? The man finally moved. Not toward her. Not away. Just enough to show that he had been waiting for her to speak first. Then, his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. I was wondering when you'd notice me, he said, his voice smooth, unbothered. Cassandra's pulse quickened. His tone wasn't threatening, but there was something unnerving about his confidence, like he already knew the outcome of this conversation. I don't have time for games, she snapped. If you have something to say, say it. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle. Then, in a voice just loud enough for her to hear, he said. You should have never slapped him. A cold chill ran down Cassandra's spine. The way he said it, it wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't a judgment. It was a warning. Her grip on her purse tightened. Who are you? She repeated, her voice sharper this time. The man exhaled softly, as if deciding how much to tell her. Then he took a step out of the shadows, allowing the dim light from the mansion to fall on him. Cassandra's stomach dropped. He wasn't just anyone. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, the kind that spoke of money, real money. His watch gleamed under the light, the brand unmistakable. This wasn't a nobody. This was someone important. And he had been watching her. She took a step back instinctively. What do you want? The man let out a quiet chuckle. You've always been quick to dismiss people, haven't you? Cassandra felt her breath hitch. Excuse me? You walk into rooms expecting to be the most important person there. But tonight, his eyes flickered toward the mansion behind her. Tonight, you were reminded that power isn't about who speaks the loudest. Her heart pounded against her ribs. He was toying with her. Testing her reaction. But why? She took another step toward her car, but he moved with her, not blocking her path, but matching her pace. She clenched her jaw. You still haven't told me who you are. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Then he said two words, and they sent a bolt of shock through her. His brother. The air around her seemed to freeze. The brother? The man she had slapped, the real owner of the mansion, had a brother? And now that she looked closer, she could see it. The same sharp jawline. The same piercing eyes. The same air of quiet authority. But this one was different. Colder. Calculating. Cassandra swallowed. What do you want from me? The man took a step forward, closing the space between them. What I want, he said, his voice dangerously soft, is to see how you handle consequences. A shiver ran through her. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. This was something bigger. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching car's engine broke the silence. The brother glanced toward the road, then back at her. Looks like your ride is here. Her ride? She frowned. I didn't call for anyone. The brother smiled, like he already knew that. The headlights grew closer, illuminating the driveway. Cassandra's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The headlights grew brighter, cutting through the dark driveway. Cassandra's breath quickened. She hadn't called for anyone, so who was coming? The brother stood still, watching the car approach with the same calm expression, as if he already knew who was inside. Cassandra's instinct screamed at her to run. But where? The mansion was off limits. The road behind her was empty. And the only other person here was a man who had just hinted that she was about to face serious consequences. The car slowed as it neared them, the engine humming smoothly. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't a security vehicle. It was a luxury black SUV. Tinted windows. Sleek. Silent. The kind of car that belonged to someone powerful. Cassandra's hands clenched into fists. She had lost control of the situation. The SUV came to a stop a few feet away. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled, filling the silence with a low, steady growl. Then, the back door opened. Cassandra's breath caught as a tall figure stepped out. The moment the man's face came into view, her stomach dropped. It was him. The gatekeeper. The man she had slapped. But this time, he wasn't in his uniform. He wore a tailored suit, the same kind his brother was wearing. His posture was different now, his presence heavier, stronger. Cassandra had assumed he was just an employee. Just some worker she could brush past without consequence. But she had been wrong. Horribly, dangerously wrong. The brother smiled, stepping aside. Ah. Now things get interesting. The former gatekeeper's eyes locked onto Cassandra. He didn't look angry. Worse. He looked amused. Get in, he said. His voice was smooth, controlled. Cassandra's heart pounded. Excuse me? The man tilted his head. I said, get in the car. Panic surged through her veins. Absolutely not. She took a step back, but his brother, the one who had been waiting in the shadows, moved ever so slightly, blocking her path. She was trapped. Cassandra forced her voice to stay steady. Why would I get in a car with a man I don't even know? The former gatekeeper's lips twitched. Don't know me? He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Cassandra, you've had dinner with me. Her blood ran cold. That wasn't possible. She would have remembered. Wouldn't she? She searched his face, her mind scrambling for a memory. Had she met him before? Was he part of some event she had attended? Don't strain yourself, he said, amusement dancing in his tone. I was just another face in the room to you. Just another nobody. Cassandra felt her throat tighten. He wasn't lying. She had met him before. And she had dismissed him. Her breath came out uneven. What do you want from me? The brother beside her chuckled. That's the third time you've asked that tonight. The former gatekeeper's eyes gleamed in the dim light. I want you to see what happens when you underestimate people. Then, before she could react, he reached for her wrist. Cassandra yanked back, but his grip was firm. Not painful. Not aggressive. But unshakable. "Let go of me." He didn't. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're used to walking into a room and deciding who matters. Tonight, you learn that the world doesn't work like that." Her pulse hammered. "You can't just." "Can't I?" His eyes held a quiet authority, the same kind she had seen in billionaires, CEOs, men who controlled everything with just a glance. Except this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was something else. A test. A game. A lesson. And she had no idea what the rules were. The former gatekeeper stepped aside, giving her just enough space to make a choice. Get in the car. Or try to fight her way out. Neither option felt safe. Neither option felt like winning. Cassandra swallowed hard. What now? Cassandra's heartbeat roared in her ears. The former gatekeeper, no, the real owner of the mansion, still held her wrist. Not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to make one thing clear. She wasn't leaving until he decided she could. The black SUV sat in the driveway like a silent threat. Its door remained open, waiting. Waiting for her. She turned her head slightly, eyes darting to his brother, the man who had watched her from the shadows. He still had that knowing smirk, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, like this was some kind of private entertainment. They were playing with her. She hated it. Cassandra yanked her arm back again. "Let me go." This time, the former gatekeeper, the man she had humiliated earlier that night, let her go without resistance. Her breath was uneven, but she refused to show weakness. She straightened her coat, lifting her chin. "I'm not going anywhere with you." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he exhaled through his nose, like he had expected this reaction. "You think you have a choice?" Cassandra forced out a cold laugh. "I do. And I'm choosing to leave." She turned sharply toward her car, but before she could take another step, his brother moved. It was so fast, so smooth, that she barely registered it. 1 second, he was standing at a safe distance. The next, he was positioned between her and the car door. Her stomach twisted. He had been waiting for her to do exactly this. A low chuckle came from behind her. "You really don't understand what's happening, do you?" Cassandra clenched her fists. She refused to be intimidated. "I understand that you're wasting my time," she snapped. "I don't know what kind of twisted game this is, but—" The former gatekeeper stepped closer, cutting her off. His voice remained calm, controlled. "No games, Cassandra. Just reality. And reality is, you crossed a line tonight." Her pulse pounded. This was ridiculous. This was insane. She had slapped a man. That was it. What kind of sick revenge was this? She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Fine. If this is about the slap, I'll apologize." His lips twitched, amused. "Oh? You'll apologize?" "Yes," she snapped, frustration boiling over. "I shouldn't have slapped you. There. Happy now?" Silence. Then he laughed. Not loud. Not mocking. Just a quiet, amused chuckle that sent cold dread creeping up her spine. "You think this is about an apology?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was an amusing little experiment. Cassandra swallowed. "Then what is it about?" His smile faded. And for the first time that night, his expression became unreadable. "You assumed I was a nobody," he said, his voice soft but sharp. "That's the part you don't understand." She flinched. Because he was right. She had assumed that. She had dismissed him as some gatekeeper, a man who didn't matter. And now she was standing in his world, completely at his mercy. Her throat felt dry. So what? You want me to beg for forgiveness? His eyes darkened. I want you to know what it feels like to be powerless. The word struck harder than she expected. A sharp silence filled the space between them. Cassandra forced herself to breathe evenly. So what now? You threaten me? Keep me here. All night? She scoffed. What do you expect me to do? His brother, the one who had been silently observing, finally spoke. Get in the car. Her stomach dropped. She shook her head. No. His voice remained cool. Then we have a problem. Tension crackled in the air. Cassandra's fingers twitched. Could she run? Scream? Would anyone help her? Her mind raced, calculating every possible escape. But then, something unexpected happened. The former gatekeeper, the man she had once dismissed as unimportant, turned his back on her. Like he wasn't even worried she would try to run. Like he already knew exactly what she would do next. Cassandra hated that feeling. She hated feeling out of control. She hated that, despite everything, despite every instinct screaming at her to leave, a small part of her wanted to know the truth. Who was he? Why had he hidden his real identity? And most importantly, what did he want from her? A slow breath escaped her lips. Then, against every ounce of logic in her body, she stepped toward the car. The moment Cassandra slid into the back seat of the black SUV, the door shut behind her with a soft, final-sounding click. The air inside was cool, too quiet. She forced herself to sit straight, pretending she wasn't unsettled. But every fiber of her being screamed that she had just made a mistake. The former gatekeeper, the man she had slapped hours ago, now revealed as someone much more powerful, settled into the seat beside her, exuding the same effortless control. His brother took the front passenger seat. The driver, a stone-faced man in black, said nothing as the car began rolling forward, smoothly gliding into the night. Cassandra folded her arms, forcing her voice to sound steady. Where are we going? The man beside her didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching the streetlights flash past, as if deciding how much he wanted to tell her. Then, finally, his gaze met hers. You'll see soon enough. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't in immediate danger. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. If they wanted to hurt her, they wouldn't have gone through all this effort. Would they? She shifted slightly, testing her surroundings. The leather seat was soft beneath her, the tinted windows blocked out most of the outside world. She was trapped. Still, she refused to sit here in silence. She turned to him, voice sharp. Why all the theatrics? If you wanted to teach me a lesson, you could have just confronted me at the gate. His lips twitched, like he found her impatience amusing. And what would that have accomplished? She scoffed. I don't know. Maybe a normal conversation? His brother chuckled from the front seat. Oh, that's funny. Cassandra clenched her fists. They were playing with her again. Her eyes narrowed at the man beside her. You keep acting like I committed some horrible crime. But all I did was slap a man I thought was a security guard. Silence. Then, very slowly, the man leaned back in his seat, studying her like she was an interesting puzzle. That's exactly the problem, he said. Her brows furrowed. What? You thought I was a security guard? You thought I was beneath you? Her stomach twisted. That's not. Tell me something, he interrupted, his voice calm but sharp. Would you have slapped me if you knew who I really was? Cassandra opened her mouth, then closed it. Because the truth was obvious. No. She wouldn't have. Her throat felt tight. Don't lie, he said smoothly. She hated how right he was. His brother chuckled again, glancing at them through the rearview mirror. People like her never think twice about their actions, until they realize they messed with the wrong person. Cassandra clenched her teeth. People like me? The man beside her didn't answer. He simply tapped his fingers against his knee, looking almost bored. I'm curious, he said after a moment. What do you actually know about me? Cassandra swallowed. She knew nothing. Not his full name. Not his history. Not why he had been working at the gate of his own mansion. She had walked into that place, judged him in seconds, and dismissed him as irrelevant. A wave of unease settled in her chest. She hated this. Hated being put on the spot like this. But she refused to let him see her sweat. Cassandra lifted her chin. Why don't you just tell me who you are? He studied her for a long moment. Then, he smirked. No. Her jaw tightened. Why not? He turned his gaze back to the window. Because you don't deserve to know yet. Her breath caught. Yet. That word echoed in her mind, unsettling her more than anything else. Cassandra exhaled sharply. So, what's your plan? Drive me around all night until I'm so tired I agree with whatever lesson you're trying to teach me? The man didn't respond. But his brother? His smirk widened. Oh, we're not just driving around. Her heart skipped a beat. The streets outside had changed. She hadn't even noticed when they left the city, but the familiar bright lights had vanished. Now, the road stretched into the darkness, flanked by nothing but trees. They were heading somewhere remote. Cassandra's pulse quickened. Where are you taking me? The brother hummed, tapping his fingers against the dashboard. You really don't like not being in control, do you? Her nails dug into her palms. No. She didn't. The SUV took a smooth turn, entering what looked like a long, private road. Tall iron gates loomed ahead, different from the ones she had seen before. This wasn't the mansion she had visited earlier. This was somewhere else. Somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned to the man beside her, forcing herself to sound calm. Tell me where we are. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small silver key. He held it between his fingers, turning it under the dim car light. Cassandra's pulse pounded. A key to what? She swallowed hard. What is that for? He finally looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. For you, he said simply. Before she could react, the SUV rolled past the gates, and the trees opened up, revealing a massive, isolated estate. Much bigger than the mansion she had been to earlier. Cassandra's blood ran cold. What had she just walked into? The SUV slowed as it rolled up the long, winding driveway. The estate ahead loomed larger with every passing second, bigger, grander, and even more imposing than the mansion she had visited earlier. Cassandra's heart pounded. This wasn't just some rich man's private property. This was something else. The iron gates behind them had closed. No turning back now. She turned to the man beside her, the same one she had slapped at the entrance of his own mansion without realizing who he was. His expression remained unreadable as he watched her. Where are we? She asked, voice tense. He didn't answer. Instead, his brother in the front seat chuckled. You'll find out soon. The SUV came to a smooth stop in front of a set of massive doors. The driver stepped out without a word and opened the door for Cassandra. She hesitated. The man beside her slid out first. He turned, looking at her expectantly. Cassandra swallowed and stepped out. The night air felt heavier here. The silence around them was thick, almost unnatural. She looked up at the grand structure before her. A fortress. That was the only way to describe it. The doors swung open as if someone had been waiting. No staff. No security guards. Just complete silence. The man gestured for her to step inside. She did. And that's when everything changed. The room that held the past. The moment she stepped in, a strange sensation gripped her chest. The interior wasn't what she expected. No luxury. No extravagant chandeliers. No grand display of wealth. Instead, the space was simple. Clean. But something about it felt unsettling. Framed photographs lined the walls. At first, she barely paid attention. But then, she froze. Because one of the photos, a black and white image of a woman standing in front of a small house, looked eerily familiar. She stepped closer. No. It was familiar. Her breath caught. The woman in the picture was her mother. Cassandra's blood turned ice cold. Her hands trembled as she reached out, fingertips barely grazing the edge of the frame. What is this?" she whispered. No one answered. She spun around, eyes wild, searching for the man who had brought her here. He was watching her. Silent. But his expression had changed. For the first time, there was something human in his gaze. Cassandra's pulse roared in her ears. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "Why is my mother's picture here?" A long pause. Then, the man finally spoke. "Because," he said quietly, "your mother was the only person who ever showed me kindness when I was a child." Her breath hitched. "What?" His voice remained calm, steady, but his eyes held years of something deeper. "She saved me once," he continued. "When I had no home. No name. When I was nothing." Cassandra couldn't breathe. What was he saying? She turned back to the photograph. Her mother had known him. 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind, but none of them made sense. Her mother had passed away years ago. She had never spoken of this man, never mentioned anything about saving someone. But then again, Cassandra had never asked. A sharp pang of guilt settled in her chest. What else had she never cared to know? She turned to him. "That still doesn't explain everything," she said, voice unsteady. His gaze didn't waver. "I was raised in an orphanage after that," he said. "But I never forgot her. She gave me something no one else did." Her lips parted, but no words came. He took a slow step forward. "And then, years later, I saw you." Her stomach twisted. "You looked just like her," he continued. "But when I saw how you treated people, how you looked down on those you thought were beneath you." Cassandra swallowed hard. "I wondered," he said. "What would she think of you?" A sharp pain struck her chest. She took a step back, shaking her head. "That's not fair," she whispered. Silence. Then. "Isn't it?" Cassandra's knees felt weak. This whole time, she had been so sure of herself. She had thought she knew everything, about power, wealth, status. But in the end, she had been blind. Blind to the past. Blind to the people around her. And blind to the one truth staring her in the face. She had become the kind of person her own mother would have hated. Her throat tightened. She turned back to the photograph. Her mother's eyes, frozen in time, held warmth. Kindness. The same kindness she had lost somewhere along the way. The weight of it all crashed down on her. Cassandra exhaled shakily. And for the first time in a long time, she felt small. The lesson that changed everything. She didn't speak for a long time. Neither did he. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then, he simply turned and walked toward the door. But before stepping out, he paused. "You're free to leave," he said without looking back. Her breath hitched. She turned to him. "That's it?" she whispered. He nodded. "I brought you here so you could see for yourself," he said. "The rest is up to you." Cassandra's heart ached. The realization hit her like a wave: he never wanted revenge. This wasn't about making her suffer. It was about making her see. And now that she had, she wasn't sure she could ever go back to who she was before. She glanced at the photograph one last time. Then, she turned and followed him into the night. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't running away. She was walking toward something new. Something better.